Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming and congratulating Mr. Bill Deresiewicz, recipient of the 2013 Hiett Prize in the Humanities.
I'm really humbled by this honor, and you've all been so wonderful and welcoming to me since I got here a couple of days ago. I've been telling people to their astonishment that it's my first time in Texas, and you've really shown me that famous hospitality. Thanks, first of all, to everyone who's made this possible: Larry, Claudia, Marie, Emily. I won't tax Kim Hyatt Jordan's modesty any further, but thank you, of course, for your extraordinary generosity. As Larry mentioned, I have a book coming out next year, Excellent Sheep. It's a phrase that came out of the mouth of one of my students at Yale once to describe herself and her cohorts. She actually said, "Are you saying that we're all just excellent sheep?" And I'm like, well, maybe not all of you, but my talk about the value of the humanities is drawn from this book. So let me just sort of quickly sketch the larger shape of the book. The first part expands on that. See, I wrote this essay 5 years ago. It's called The Disadvantages of an Elite Education. I was on my way out the door at Yale. It was basically like the grumblings of a about-to-be ex-professor. Not about, the treatment of academics. That's a separate issue, but this sort of excellent sheephood, the hoop jumping, the risk aversion, the timidity, the narrow sort of education that we give our, quote, best and brightest. And it came out in the American Scholar. I thought it was going to sink without a trace, but the miracle of the internet put it into circulation immediately, and people are still reading it. It's been read over 1 million times, which is just inconceivable to me. I remember when I was happy that it had passed 10,000. The point is, it really struck a nerve, right? It really brought out a hunger that students have today for a meaningful education. And that's why I've been going around campuses for the last 5 years, because they keep inviting me because they want to talk about this. A lot of times I'm invited by student groups. So the first part of the book expands on that whole critique and the history. Why does the education look the way it does, which really means why does the admissions process look the way it does? The middle half of the book, how can students save themselves? Because they can't wait for us to get our act together. Hopefully we will, but they can't wait, right? So I say you need to take care of your own education and your own direction in life. Because they always say, how can I find my passion? That you keep telling me to do this, but I don't know how to find my passion. And I'm like, yeah, of course not, because that's not what you're taught how to do. You're taught how to jump through the next hoop. So that's parts 2 and 3, and part 3. Of those, right, the second half of that is about what college should be. And what it should be is a liberal arts education centered on the humanities, taught by teachers in small classrooms, seminar-style teaching. So my talk is going to be drawn from that about, what is the value of the humanities? Why should we do this? And then the last part, just to finish quickly, goes back to the larger social critique. Because, Larry, to answer your question, this is how the interview ended yesterday on KERA. She said, well, why should we care about this? This sounds like it's only about the elite. And I said, well, to a certain extent it is. It's not about the other 90% of higher education, which is also very important, maybe more important. But we should all care about it, because we all live in a society that's governed by an elite that was produced by this system. And there are real problems with that. I wish I had more time to talk about it, She said, well, can you do it in 15 seconds? So I said, okay. I said, we have an elite. Our elite are narrow, timid, self-serving, out-of-touch technocrats who are leading us off a cliff. Okay. And then I had 11 seconds to spare, so that was perfect. All right. So, but let's talk about the value of the humanities. I start this chapter by talking about liberal arts education in general, and the liberal arts and the humanities are not exactly the same, and there's a distinction to be made there, because the liberal arts also include the sciences and social sciences. The liberal arts really are those fields of study that are pursued for their own sake, where knowledge is pursued for its own sake, not vocational, right? Not nursing or teacher training or anything like that, right? And then I talk about the practical utility of the liberal arts, because that really needs to be argued for. But I'm not going to talk about that now. Maybe it'll come up in the Q&A or the discussion afterwards. And then I say practical utility however, is not the ultimate purpose of a liberal arts education. Its ultimate purpose is to help you to learn to think in the widest and deepest sense, beyond the requirements of work and career. For the sake of citizenship, for the sake of living well with others, above all, for the sake of building a self that is strong and creative and free. That's why the humanities should be central to a college education. The humanities, history, philosophy, religious studies, above all, literature and the other arts, are the record of the ways that people have come to terms with being human. They address the questions that are proper to us, not as this or that kind of specialist, this or that kind of professional, but as individuals as such. The very questions we are apt to ask when we look up from our work and think about our lives, something that comes very naturally, especially to young people. Questions of love, death, family, morality, time, truth, God, and everything else within the wide, starred universe of human experience. The humanities are what we have in a secular society instead of religion. They are compatible with religion, but they have also, in important ways, supplanted it. As traditional beliefs were broken down across the 18th and 19th century by science, by the skeptical critique of the Enlightenment, the arts emerged as the place where educated people went to contemplate those questions of meaning and value and purpose. Now the truth was multiple and personal, not settled and dogmatic. Instead of looking in the Bible, you read Dostoevsky, or listened to Beethoven, or went to an Ibsen play. Libraries, museums, and theaters, and places like the Dallas Institute, became the new churches, places where you came to court the old emotions of catharsis, transcendence, redemption, and joy. The arrangement became known as aestheticism, the religion of art. As Whitman put it in his characteristically modest way, the priest departs, the divine literatus comes. It's no coincidence, as Andrew Dabanco points out, that English became an object of university study around the very same time that aestheticism crystallized as an idea. The center of the college curriculum swung slowly from the Greek and Latin classics, taught by rote as fixed bodies of knowledge, to English and the other humanities. But the change was really a form of continuity. Most colleges had been founded as church-affiliated institutions, and now they sought to carry on their spiritual mission under the secular dispensation. Or in the case of the University of Dallas, which quite frankly I'd never heard of before and have become very interested in, not under the secular dispensation, but with a profound understanding that they're connected. Besides the specialized programs of study in the scientific and other disciplines that were also introduced in the late 19th century, or in more familiar terms, majors, there emerged the humanistic components of the liberal arts curriculum, including the great books and other general education courses that were designed to provide an opportunity for students to think about what we call the big questions. The minister in the college chapel preaching doctrine gave way to the professor in the classroom leading a discussion. Okay, that sounds good. But why art? I mean, as I say, the study of the arts, literature, and the other arts is the center of the humanities. So what claim does art have on the truth? If the latter is so difficult to come by, then how do artists manage it? And I'm going to say it in one sentence. I think this is the essence of it. By looking very hard and long and working very hard and long to tell us what they saw. Anyone who's tried to paint an object or a scene will understand this point. It takes tremendous concentration just to see what's actually in front of you, let alone to get it down on canvas, to perceive a cup of water, say, not simply as an instrument of use, something that you barely glance at as you satisfy your thirst, but in the full particularity of its material existence. The liquid color of the glass, the fingerprints around the middle, the rim of light at the meniscus, the shape of the translucent shadow that the whole thing casts. As with painting, so with every art. In literature, what is observed is not primarily the physical world, but the psychological and social ones. The poet looks at what she really feels about her body or her sister, not what she's supposed to feel. The novelist reflects upon the way we really treat each other, the pettiness or callousness or secret, irrational longing, not the way we say we do. Those conventional modes of thought and emotion from which you need to free yourself, the party lines we spout, the happy talk that we're surrounded by, are exactly what art does its work by breaking through. There's a reason we avoid the truth with our sociable lies and our psychological blocks, which is it's usually too hard to bear. Kafka said, "A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us." John Ruskin, the greatest art critic of the 19th century, as well as one of its greatest social critics, a personal hero of mine, a crucial influence on Proust, Gandhi, and many others, put the matter this way: the more I think of it, I find this conclusion more impressed upon me, that the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one. And if you think that he meant this in a metaphorical sense, you're getting him precisely wrong. He means literally seeing. Our eyes slide over the world as we obsess about our grades or our sex life or our income. Our minds slide over it. Art, to paraphrase the poet Shelley, bursts the spirit's sleep. Now, to say that the humanities can be a path to truth is itself to challenge one of the most closely held beliefs of our time. We live not only in a scientific world, but also in a scientistic one, a world that thinks that science, empirical, objective, quantifiable, is the exclusive form of knowledge, and that other modes of inquiry are valid only insofar as they approximate its methods. But the humanities and science face in opposite directions. They don't just work in different ways, they look at different things. To borrow a term from Stephen Jay Gould, who was certainly one scientist who did understand the value of the arts, science and the humanities are non-overlapping magisteria. He uses that phrase, that impressive phrase, to describe the difference between science and religion, but it's also true of science and art. Non-overlapping magisteria, different forms of teaching that are each appropriate to their own domain. Scientific knowledge relates to external reality, to that which lies outside our minds and makes itself available for objective observation. Humanistic knowledge relates to our experience of the world, to what reality feels like. The painter renders the subjective experience of sight, including, especially in modern art, the dreams or dreads that we project on what we see. The novelist seeks to give us the taste of what it's like to be alive at a particular moment. I once told my brother, the doctor, that as a literary critic, I was interested in questions of time and space. And he looked at me as if I had said that as a literary critic, I was interested in performing brain surgery. But this time and space I meant were not the physicists. They were the experience of space and time as represented by the novelist. And you can think of time in Proust or space in Dickens. The scientist seeks to be objective and appeals to the impersonal language of numbers. The artist speaks from individual experience and appeals to our individual experience. Humanistic knowledge isn't verifiable or quantifiable or reproducible. It can't be expressed in terms of equations or general laws. It changes from culture to culture and indeed from person to person. It's a matter not of calculation, but interpretation. When we engage in humanistic inquiry, or in plainer language, when we think about a poem or a sculpture or a piece of music, we ask not how big is it, or how hot is it, or what does it consist of, but what does it mean? We ask of a scientific proposition, is it true? But of a proposition in the humanities, we ask, is it true for me? Is it true for me? Does it make sense not to me, but of me? The highest function of art, and of literature in particular, is to bring us to that knowledge of ourselves that college ought to start to give us. The ultimate reason to read the classic authors, Mark Edmondson says, is to see if they may know you better than you know yourself. I heard from a psychiatrist who uses literature as a tool of practice. I had written a review of Tolstoy, and he wrote to me, and his letter was so interesting that I cyber-stalked him and discovered that he was, in fact, a psychiatrist. And I said, this was so interesting, do you ever do this? And he wrote another very interesting email that said, among other things, I recently terminated a 6-year course of treatment with a man who was initially referred because he'd become addicted to narcotics. He was a deeply depressed, inhibited, bitter, and unfulfilled person. I suggested that he read D.H. Lawrence, and in this case, a rare exception, he took me up on the offer, the challenge really, and for most of his treatment, Lawrence was our constant companion. When I was a kid, people found themselves in literature. I found myself for the first time when I was 14 in The Catcher in the Rye, no more. But this man would come in and read to me from Lawrence and say, "That's me. That's me." That is the essential experience of art. We see ourselves in the other and the other in ourselves. Freud speaks of the uncanny, by which he means something that is both strange and familiar at once, strangely familiar. So it is with the revelations of art. Art brings us home by taking us abroad. We read of Hamlet or Jane Eyre, and across the differences of time and place, with a pang of guilt and bliss, we see our nature mirrored up to us, but seen as if anew. Find yourself is perfect, that phrase. You're reading about medieval Denmark, which is this very strange world of courtiers and princes, and all at once, as if in a dream, you somehow find yourself among them. Art gives names to experience. We recognize Antigone or the wife of Bath or Madame Bovary as permanent human types, as well as permanent potentialities within ourselves. We can think of the role that literary characters have played, Ahab, Huck Finn, Gatsby, Holden, in articulating the American consciousness. But art also gives you models for experience, especially when you're young. You find in Elizabeth Bennet or Stephen Dedalus an image of the person that you want to be. Books are maps of possible futures. Reading, Edmondson says, is life's grand second chance. Art does not make you a better person. It only makes you a freer one. But popular culture also gives you models for experience, and so does advertising. That's really what it's about. 50 Shades of Grey or a Nike commercial or half the pop songs in the world. They tap directly into our id. That's why they're so powerful. They submerge us in fantasies of pleasure and power. And of course, I mean, who wouldn't want to live like that if it were possible? I mean, that's what the id says. Give me that. But the difference is that art provides you both the models and the means to question them. It demands that you read alertly with your mind and not just your glands. What are the limits of living like Elizabeth Bennet? What might Stephen Dedalus miss about himself? What does Holden get wrong? What does Ahab get right? If the liberal arts turn certainties into questions, the humanities do that in particular with ethical and existential certainties, our convictions about how we should act and whom we should be. Stories, says the writer Andrei Codrescu, are engines of reflection. And that reflection doesn't only go to values and the kinds of things upon which you might make life choices. Everything we find in life, we find in art. Ambition in Macbeth and in The Sopranos, ennui in Chekhov and Fellini, marginality in Ralph Ellison and Arundhati Roy, and on and endlessly on. I've learned from Dante that love and hate are complements, not opposites, which is a good thing to know when you're part of a family, for example. From E.M. Forster that liberal attitudes are often a mask for vanity and ignorance, which is also a very useful thing to know. From Mary Gateskill, something of the ways the soul is manifested in the body. Now, I don't know if any of those perceptions have influenced my choices exactly, but they have deeply shaped my understanding of myself and the world. Edmondson speaks of the incessant labor of combining your own experience, taken in and metabolized by intense feeling and thought, with what you have acquired in books. Art and life, back and forth, each illuminating the other, both together creating a self. I should say that there was a previous chapter where I said the purpose of going to college is to create a self, the central purpose. Now, I said before that when you paint an object, you have to see it in the full particularity of its existence. To borrow a phrase from Matthew Arnold, the Victorian man of letters, you have to see it at, quote, as in itself it really is. In itself and for itself, not in reference to you, as an instrument of or obstacle to your desire. But it isn't just things. We also tend to treat each other as extensions of ourselves. Art forces you to do the opposite. By allowing you to experience in the most intimate and immediate way what it feels like to be someone else, Achilles or Anna Karenina or Emily Dickinson, art instills the fundamental moral lesson, which is that you are not the center of the universe. That others weren't created for your benefit. That they are just as real as you, with equal claims to dignity and understanding. The novelist and philosopher Rebecca Goldstein says, "I place my faith in fiction, in its power to make vividly present how different the world feels to each of us. Art teaches empathy and cultivates the emotional intelligence." Maybe it can make you a better person. But I emphasize maybe and can. A student asked me, one of these events, he said, "Do you really lead a better life for having had a liberal arts education?" And I said, "Yes, actually you do. And those around you might lead better ones as well." The social sciences seem to be all the rage today among today's idealistic young. David Brooks calls them the empirical kids. Policy, wonkery, big data. But you can only measure what you know is there, and sometimes you can't measure it at all. Before you start to build a better future with what Kant called the crooked timber of humanity, you need to find out what you're working with. You need to know what people are, how they think, what they want, how they act, as well as something of the moral pitfalls of your proposed interventions. I would say that the law of unintended consequences is pretty much the governing principle of narrative art. You wouldn't really have too many stories without the law of unintended consequences. The humanities put back everything the social sciences, by way of necessary simplification, take out. Only literature, in the words of the diplomatic strategist Charles Hill, is methodologically unbounded enough to show how the world really works. I've heard it said that novels are obsolete, that books like War and Peace date from a time when information could only be delivered in very inefficient forms, which isn't even true historically. But I think it's a prevalent idea. But War and Peace doesn't tell you the same kinds of things that you can learn from a blog post or a Wikipedia entry, not even 1,400 pages of them. It needs to be big and complex because it's telling you something that's big and complex. It doesn't give us information. It gives us life. Now, I have a few more minutes. 5 maybe? 5 or 6? Okay, I don't want to take too long. The defenders of the arts and humanities tend to give the argument away before it begins. Art is solace, we're told, or diversion, or decoration. Nothing more apparently than a pleasant relaxation, highbrow entertainment for the moneyed class. The arts, we hear, contribute to the local economy, as if their very point were not to show us that there's more to being human than our bodies and their needs, more to a society than its commodities. When it comes to college in particular, the argument revolves around what's known as cultural capital, the kind of social information that equips you for upward mobility. No less a figure than Stephen Greenblatt, the Harvard professor, prize-winning author, Renaissance scholar, has defended the value of studying the humanities by telling us in part that cultural knowledge turns out to be good for your career. I think we could set a slightly higher bar than that. Now, I recognize the practical importance of cultural capital and the role of college in providing it, but I doubt that it has very, very much to do at this point with the humanities. The development of those great bookstores in the 20s and 30s was indeed, in large measure, an attempt to socialize the great unwashed, the mainly Jews and Catholics from Southern and Eastern Europe, the children of the great immigration, into the cultural tradition that had only been accessible to WASPs. But any argument in that direction, I think, did not survive the dethroning of high culture in the 60s and 70s. Virgil and Rousseau are not what people talk about at cocktail parties anymore, assuming they ever did. Leonardo and Mozart no longer constitute a shared frame of reference unless you meet Leonardo DiCaprio. No one at the dinner party is going to find out whether you know anything about Montaigne, and if they did, they wouldn't care. The humanities are all well and good, goes another argument for the children of the privileged who don't need to worry about making a living. But other students, even at selective schools, should stick to the practical disciplines, mainly the quantitative ones, engineering, computer science. The notion echoes something Woodrow Wilson said a century ago. We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class, very much larger, to forego the privileges of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. If you substitute the term technical for manual, this is what a lot of people think now. It's not the proponents of a liberal education who are the elitists. It is those that would reserve it for the lucky few. Now, is there something condescending or imperialistic in the current term about suggesting that children of immigrants ought to study English in the Western classics? Well, maybe, but there's also something immensely powerful, and not just in personal terms. Those Jewish kids between the world wars who were socialized into Western culture went on to take possession of it. Saul Bellow, Norman Mailer, J.D. Salinger, Leonard Bernstein, and countless others, including a little later Philip Roth, Susan Sontag, Woody Allen, and someone who I understand was a guest of yours, Stephen Sondheim. They propelled themselves to the center of American art and thought, transforming it in their image. I think the best thing that could happen to our culture now is if the Asian and Latino kids did the same. Telling them to stick to medicine or finance is just another way of keeping those communities down. But it's not my intention to advocate for great books courses. I think they're valuable. I think they're important as a part of our past. But those civic purposes are secondary. The crucial thing is to study not the great books, but simply great books. The idea is to find yourself a few of Kafka's axes. Anything that has the necessary edge and heft will do. Doesn't matter who created it, as long as it can do some damage, as long as it inflicts that wound. The canon is irrelevant in this respect. A real reader creates her own canon, for it consists precisely of those books that she has used to create herself. I'm also not suggesting that every kid has to be an English major, though it's not the worst idea, or even a humanities major. You just, just to give yourself as many chances as possible in college to have those kinds of experiences. You do need to specialize, now more than ever. One of the misconceptions is that those two things are antithetical, the general and the specialized. Although the notion does lie very deep in our culture. We talk about action versus contemplation. In the Renaissance, it was arms and arts. The Romans talked about otium, leisure, versus negotium, like business, right? Negotiate. The ultimate idea of a liberal arts education is to render that distinction meaningless. There isn't life over here and work over there, general courses for the first and your major for the second. The perspectives that you get from studying the general, the wisdom to come right out and say the word, are meant to interpenetrate the practice of your specialty. Because it is inevitable that you will train yourself to do one or just a few things, but it's not inevitable that you will only think about that thing. What the habit of reflection will enable you to do is to bring the full range of human experiences, of your experiences, upon your work. If you become a doctor, it's the difference between being a healer and being a pill pusher, between someone who treats people and someone who treats diseases. My professor, my mentor said that a teacher is someone who teaches students, not courses. And it's the same idea. The fact is that we're suffering today from just such a cadre of technocrats, just such a specialized elite. Heather Wilson, former congresswoman and longtime veteran of the Rhodes Scholarship selection process, has talked of her distress at the quality of recent applicants. Even from America's great liberal arts colleges, transcripts reflect an undergraduate specialization that would have been unthinkably narrow just a generation ago. As a result, she says, high-achieving students seem less able to grapple with issues that require them to think across disciplines or reflect on difficult questions about what matters and why. Our great universities are producing top students who have given very little thought to matters beyond their impressive grasp of an intense area of study. That's what she said. But it's not only our leaders. I've talked to teachers, social workers, psychiatrists, not to mention doctors, who feel that in our rush for efficiency, our addiction to methodologies and metrics, testing regimes, protocols, psychopharmacology, spreadsheets, the management mentality in all its incarnations, the human has been torn from what they do. The humanities are where we can all go to start to put it back. Now, some professions really don't leave room. I mean, if you're a transplant surgeon, like what room there, But you don't transplant in a vacuum. You're part of a system. A team, a hospital, medical industry, a society. Instead of just putting your head down and doing your job, you can look around how things work and try to make them better. You can reflect. You can resist. You can become, in other words, a citizen. Not a leader necessarily, this fetishized word we have now, but also not a follower. That idea, after all, that school should prepare you for participation in that very rare thing in human history, collective self-government, is fundamental to our educational system. It's the reason that American school children are asked to question, express their ideas, develop their creativity, learn by exploring and investigating. We don't teach by rote, the way they do in India. We don't separate our 10-year-olds into academic and vocational tracks. the way they do in Germany. We don't require undergraduates to study just a single subject, the way they do in Britain. We have always wanted people who are more than merely specialists. So what then? Are we to be a country in which everybody is dissenting all the time, challenging the way that things are done in the public sphere and even in the workplace? Yes, that's exactly what we ought to be. We are a republic. We're supposed to lead together. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for those comments. Very wonderful. I would like to take just a few minutes, an opportunity, because we don't get to have you for very long. But you are, I would like everyone to know, you are coming back. That's part of the agreement.
Part of the deal, that's right.
Part of the deal. And you're going to be in the hands of Claudia Allums and our Cowan Center, and you're going to be working with teachers and maybe principals and superintendents as well. So we're looking forward to your coming back, but I wanted to take this opportunity to just get into a couple of things that you brought up. But I mainly want to talk about the name of our organization, because you talked to us eloquently about the value of the humanities, of art. That's one of the words, humanities, one of the two key words in the title of our organization, the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, up on the screen. I'd like you now to speak about the other key word, culture, a little bit. We talk about that endlessly here. What is it? How is it made? You know, what does it consist of? How does it change? Several years ago, we asked the same question of playwright David Mamet, who was a keynote speaker at one of our Hiett Award events. That was in 2008. And he was very eloquent on the subject, and he said in part, he called culture, quote, the essential, priceless, sustaining gift of a people. This is how we do things here. I take it he was talking about a good, healthy culture, and culture is not necessarily a good, healthy thing. You talked about the rush for efficiency in our current culture. Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? You know, how do you think about culture? If you could give us just a few reflections.
Sure, thanks. I think it's actually useful to point out that we mean two different things by the word now. There's that old high culture Matthew Arnold sense, the arts. And then there's the sense that really derives from anthropology, that it's sort of the total expressive life of a society. But actually, it's really useful to think about those two terms together. I'm a cultural critic in both senses. I mean, it's weird. We use that word now and again. We have that confusion. But I've been forced to articulate what that means. And I realize that in the broader sense, it means to become conscious of the way that we think and feel together, the words we use, the words that we don't use, like we don't use virtue anymore, and we prefer values, or freedom is our highest ideal, leadership. Okay. What I think the relationship between the two and why a healthy high culture is important is because culture in that sense is really a criticism, a critique, a reflection on culture in the broad sense. You can never see a play or go to the symphony, but you are part of that collective consciousness. You are being thought by society, right? Society is handing you the terms, handing us all the terms in which to think and feel. Culture, in the other sense, is precisely an opportunity to become conscious of that and to question whether we like the way we're thinking and feeling, or maybe we should do it a different way.
So culture is not an altogether unconscious thing. I mean, there are some ways in which we can be agents in forming it as we go.
Yeah, and I mean, I think culture in the sense that in the title of, in the name of your institute is precisely the effort to become conscious, the effort to see what's in front of you, like Ruskin said, to become conscious of culture in the larger sense, the mentality that we all share, that we're all born into. Yeah.
To go further, the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture has this stated purpose. It exists to deepen and enrich the practical life of the city with the wisdom and imagination of the humanities. The two key words in that statement of purpose are wisdom, and humanities. You just talked about the word virtue, the
Right.
virtues.
Right.
To go back to the ancient Greeks, there was a time when we did talk about the virtues, with the cardinal virtues being courage, moderation, justice, and wisdom. And the ancients, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, put wisdom always at the top of that hierarchy, right? Something that you attain toward but you never reach in this life, perhaps, but you ought to be on the path to it. Today, we don't talk about wisdom, we talk about knowledge as an accumulation of facts.
We didn't even talk about knowledge, we talk about information, right?
Right, about information. Should we work to get the notion, the idea of wisdom back, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a culture can be so characterized not just by the words that are most important to it, but also by the words that it never uses. And wisdom is really conspicuously absent. It has an archaic flavor. I think you sort of have to almost apologize for using it if you're going to use it at all. What does it mean? I'm not sure I've reflected on it adequately enough. I think there's a formula that says that wisdom equals experience plus time. But there's got to be another factor in that equation, which is reflection. It's not just experience plus time. I mean, not every older person is that wise, quite frankly. There are lots of old fools as well as young ones. So that's what I would add to it. Is I'm not sure I can give you a great definition of wisdom. I don't want to give a hasty one, but I do know, I think, that reflection is essential to it. And again, I think that reflection is the essential act of culture, right? It's the way we become conscious of ourselves.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and I would take it that you would say that curriculum in schools does matter. What we say. You were talking about finding great books, right? You didn't specify what culture they might come from or
right. That's
time
right.
period.
That's right.
But it needs to be the great books. So not only time and experience, but what you spend that time experiencing, I suppose. You
can't just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. I mean, we don't expect kids to do that in any other area of their lives, right? I think you are helped to reflection by reading the reflections of others. And the reason that great books are valuable is because they're the most powerful. They're the most powerful, the wisest reflections. So yes, I mean, obviously what we teach students matters a lot. I think probably how we teach them matters a whole lot more. We seem to think of, because we've come to think of not only wisdom as knowledge, but knowledge as information, we seem to think that education is about transferring some quantity of information from the teacher's head to the students. You might as well do it with a computer, right? A computer can do it just as well. That's not what education is at all. It's about bringing out the powers that lie within the student. And you need space for that, you need patience, maybe fewer tests.
And maybe fewer tests, as our superintendent here was about to applaud that. And maybe you need teachers who have wisdom, right? Which is
right.
Something else we don't.
Right.
Well, this segues into the final word. Let me check the time. We'll have time for a couple of questions. But the final word in our mission statement that I would like for you to talk about is imagination.
Yeah.
And imagination has sort of lost its reputation among us. We normally, or most often, think about it as a sort of a dreaminess, a fantastic take on the world, a child's faculty, whereas it used to be thought of as, and you were talking in your comments, you were talking about seeing and creating, seeing and making something, right? Which is the artist's function. How do you think about imagination today? Is it important, and if so, how?
Right. It's interesting. Again, I think imagination lives this kind of ghostly life now in our public discourse, because two words that we talk about all the time are creativity and, even more, innovation. Everything has to be innovative. Everybody has to think outside the box and be a creative leader and all this nonsense. But I think that ghostly life exists because we dimly recognize that that's where even our material prosperity, our continuing material prosperity, is going to come from. And people talk about Steve Jobs, taking calligraphy classes. here's what I think. I think that when somebody does something really creative or says something really original, people will say, you know, I've never thought about that before. I think the reason that they've never thought about it is because, again, our thinking is confined within the parameters that we take for granted. And the act of education, culture, creativity, imagination, it almost may be less a matter of sort of inventing something than of stepping back far enough to see what the boundaries of our discourse are. In other words, what are the thoughts that we are not allowed to think? So much, not even ones that are you know, that are discouraged out loud, but the ones that it never occurs to anyone to think. And I mean, these ideas have been brought to me partly because when I think about the most creative people, you know, Picasso, people who creativity seems to pour out of them, the chief characteristic seems to be this ability to step outside of every preconception and to just be completely uninhibited in what they think. There's no censors on them. I mean, Emerson said that we reject our best ideas because we immediately think, I'm not allowed to think that. And then when we read them in Shakespeare or Socrates, they come back to us, what does he say, with an alienated majesty, right? Yeah. So you know, that's my understanding of imagination. It is ultimately really the ability, you know, to step outside what's already being thought.
To as it were, back up enough to see the box that you're being asked to stay within.
Right, right.
Gail Thomas and Joanne Stroud tell me that in the early days of the Dallas Institute, one thought was to call the organization the Dallas Institute of Imagination and Culture. And you know, there were discussions before it settled on this. And when we talk about bringing the imagination of the humanities into the city, we seem to imply that everyone has one, right? That the imagination is not just the possession of a Picasso or Steve Jobs.
Right.
Do you see it that way, that it's a sort of a universal faculty that all of us do?
Yeah, I do. My wife is a children's art teacher, and she doesn't like as much teaching kids who are older than second or third grade, because the fifth and sixth graders have already been taught what their art is supposed to look like, and it's not as interesting and spontaneous anymore.
Yeah.
So I think actually imagination, what we mainly do with it is to try to suppress it as much as possible. And then, you know, maybe 10 years later we have to find ways to, like, I mean, isn't that what they do in art school? Like, they teach you to kind of be spontaneous again. But why do you have to be taught? Well, only because you've already been taught not to be. So look, I don't think everyone is a genius. I don't think everyone should be a painter. But yes, I do think that that's it's essential a human. It's really a very interesting anthropological fact about us. My professor, who's the son of an anthropologist, would often say that it's this strange fact about humans that our imagination continues to develop throughout our lives, even after our bodies have stopped developing and gone into decline. It's really, I mean, there's really something quite profound about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about the poetic imagination being really essential to the creation and growth of a great city. You know, and to put that adjective poetic makes it sound strange, you know, even more alien, but it is that sense of seeing and making that you were talking about. Yeah. I'd like to open it up and see if anybody has questions. Yes.
I'm a fan. And I just became a fan after listening to you. I was trying to tweet everything you were saying. My thumbs are not fast enough. So I serve as the executive director of the Dallas Education Foundation. We're the foundation that supports Dallas School District.
I think you're supposed to hold the top, yeah.
That's a good.
That's what they told.
You're so profoundly.
Yeah. No, they told us before.
Yeah. So my question is this: in a school district that serves, you know, upwards of 90% of our students on free and reduced lunch, you know, at-risk, low socioeconomic income brackets, things like that. And then I'm going back to the thought of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It seems as though the conversation that we're saying in traditional settings would be categorized in the self-actualization, the very top. So in our conversations about how to infuse the thoughts and the ideas that you've spoken about into our education, but not just into how we do it, but our value system in education. What are some thoughts that you have about that? Is anyone doing it well? And how does that look? Simple question.
Okay, there was a great essay in the Times recently. It was about something else, but the guy who sort of does some of what I do, he said, "My business is complaining, not answers." And I'm not, and I'm not an educational professional. I was a college professor. I don't know anything formal about primary or secondary. Okay. So I don't know how I'm going to give you a great concrete answer. And look, obviously, when I talked about the problems of the other 90%, even of the college world, which is already privileged, I mean, it's all about underfunding, right? So how do you talk about poetry when the kids don't even have enough to eat? Well, why does it have to be either or, right? I mean, that's obvious. Do you know about Earl Shorus and the Clementi course in the humanities? I'm not an expert on this. A guy named Earl Shorus, I think he died a few years ago. He said, the humanities should belong to everyone and are valuable. Again, it's not just the sort of the cherry on top of privilege. And he developed a course in the humanities in inner city Queens, I think it was, Queens or Brooklyn, that's now been widely replicated. And I know someone who teaches in a women's prison near Stanford, the same kind of course, or a halfway house, actually. The humanities, I think they're actually much more powerful for kids who haven't had an elite education and for whom, again, it's kind of just like the dusting on top, and who don't feel, in a really visceral sense, just how vitally powerful they are. But Earl Shorus writes about this. He's got an article in Harper's that we can talk about, where he describes what this is about and how the students recognize, adults and teenagers both, not only how incredibly empowering it is for them, but how it's essential to the way the privileged have already been empowered. And again, it's not about cultural knowledge dropping names. It's about the mastery that comes from self-reflection, the mastery of your own passions, the mastery of the world around you, your ability to understand other people, which is a very important practical skill. So I haven't at all even addressed your question, but that's, people have done it. I don't know how they've done it exactly, but it has been done. And not with a lot of funding. He wasn't one of those guys who went out and raised, millions of dollars. Did I, yeah?
Well, you gave me a name, so
There you go. There you go.
We have time for one last question. Does anyone have one? Yes. Yes. Terry? Right.
I have 5 graduating seniors 5 years in a row. I have 5.
Hold it like this.
On the top. There you go. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. I have no technical.
No, hold it like.
I have 5 graduating seniors 5 years in a row. And what do you have any good advice for finding a place that's good for the humanities for them?
Yeah, I think the liberal arts colleges do a much better job than the universities.
The smaller ones?
And this, I can't. And I'll also say, the sort of everybody wants to go to the most prestigious school, top 10. I think I would even stay away from the top 10, even among the liberal arts colleges, because the students are often very similar to the ones in Ivy League, Stanford, Duke, those kind of places. Because they've been, they're the straight A kids, the top 1%. There are a lot of really, I hear great things about Kenyon College, Bard College, Sewanee, Reed College, Lawrence, thank you. We're at Lawrence University in Wisconsin, where I gave a talk and learned about the great stuff they're doing. And again, quite frankly, had never heard of Lawrence before. It has a fairly regional, which means that there are probably a lot of Lawrences around the country, right? I think there are a lot of good colleges, not, does that help? You got 5 shots at it.
Thank you, Bill. Thank
Okay.
you. Congratulations again.